State actors are, as it were, the shadow of hierarchy, which define the rules of decision-making, define who is, so to say, taking part in the definition of the rules, and are a fallback position too in case they wouldn't get their act together, in order to ensure precisely that there is not a jungle out there. And it's certainly not about postmodernism. It's just relying more on private actors' knowledge and expertise, but in a regulated framework where the state still plays an important role. And examining the entire literature on new modes of governance just agrees that the role is, the state is not disappearing, but that its role is changing in some ways.
It's more realistic.
But the problem is our traditional understanding then is that we have this division of politics and administration. We have this division of law and practice. We have a lot of binary understandings, and they are intermingled in this new system. So, as you say, you're working under the shadow of a hierarchy, but then go to a lawyer and ask him or her to interpret that, and they cannot. So we have some problems. A shadow can be a lot of things, so to say. So it's the first step towards conceptualizing a new way of organizing our society, new roles for different actors, and new relations between them in performing those roles. But we really don't grasp it conceptually, do we?
There are beginnings in work of Landseyer, for instance, about calibration of the role of the state in new modes of governance, or the work of Schaaf, defining the shadow of hierarchy as majority decisions in Parliament, or executive intervention, or court rulings. And all played an important role in the co-production of action of public and private actors, but by no means disappearing or just.
No, I mean, I was really saying there was nothing, therefore there's nothing new in any of that. I mean, that's something which there's been a long history of that sort of activity, even in Britain, and going back to the First World War.
Exactly, look at Germany and 100 years of co-action of public and private actors in the context of public regulation in the areas of provision of social services, insurance, provision, and so on and so forth, technical regulation. It's a long tradition.
But that is still something which has its own boundaries, both as a discipline and as a practice. Because in that, as you say, that there is a concept of some part of society which is sui generis, whether we think of it as the government or the community or the state.
It's really all modes of government, pre-modern modes of government, in that way.
But I think we are at the right level to discuss the identity of public administration, yeah? And that the identity has to be grounded in kind of good governance. And then the question is, what is good governance? Yes. And as I understand you well, when you follow, say, the modernist approach, good governance is a kind of solidarity represented by the state. I could imagine a more postmodern way of approaching good governance, and that is avoiding cruelty. Yeah, that's the Rorty approach. And the one is more, say, a positive, and the other is more a negative, and a boundary condition. And I think the developments we are experiencing now in our societies is from a positive solidarity to a more negative, avoidance of cruelty. And that's a different definition of, say, the role of the state and the content of good governance. But both can be represented in public administration.
Please don't get me wrong. I'm all in favour of that. I mean, with all the figure of names, but it's almost stoical. I'm very much, very much hope things. As I say, there is no way back to the old state and quite the way it was. But to be aware that the historical transition needs attention, and that it still needs a subject which is more than just something which brings together various disparate kinds of collective activity in different localities or in different places. That there is still a notion of there are certain standards of values to be protected, be it avoidance of harm or whatever.
It is a contextual question, isn't it? In what kinds of society, what modes of government are meaningful, effective? So in the affluent society, maybe public administration, government should have another role, another type of collective action, should encompass another type of collective action than in the, let's say, the struggle of capitalism, or how do you say it, the emancipation, or instead of English word, of people. So in the Netherlands now, the multicultural issue is a big issue, and it may need another type of government, another mode of government, than getting everybody educated.
But if I may say so, I would see that kind of discourse as being very much part of public administration.
That's public administration.
Good.
Sorry?
2 points. One is about the question, is it new or is it not new, this idea of public action? So it is a lot discussed today in France. And of course, all this question of consultation or co-protection between the state and the private actors, it's not new. It existed before, but especially in the period where there is a crisis or some uncertainty. But it raises new questions today because it has more visibility. It's more obvious. There is more transparency about this kind of question. So it raises new questions. And another point also is that I see that in Great Britain, this idea of public action or modernization of the state is very often handled as a question of improving management. So it's, all the stream of new public management is not very well developed in France. So we of course, this question of modernization of the state, of using the methods of management in the administrations, so it is present, but I think that we think that it is not enough to examine the questions under this particular standpoint, because the political dimensions are not enough handled. So for us, the idea of public action doesn't only mean, you said, does it mean something else than consultation? So yes, it means something else than consultation, because studying the notion of public action means both studying the process, so the consultation, the interactions between different kinds of stakeholders, but also how through this process you have a change in the institution. So you cannot separate this notion of process and this notion of change in the institutions. So, it's clear.
Yeah, this is very interesting, this problem of the old state and the new state. Of course, things are evolving continuously. I think that the main problem is that the new state have to cope with different scales, in different geographic scale and a different temporal scale. The old state had to I think at that time the global interest of people within one state and the interest, the collective, and the individual interest were easy to harmonize. Of course, the state was there to solve the conflicts, but those conflicts were solvable there are the conflicts between social things and the economy, industry and workers. The state was there to avoid conflicts with other states, and we were building that things, and it was quite successful in the northern hemisphere. And now the main problem is that we have to cope with different scales. For instance, the temporal scale. We have that problem in France, but I think it's everywhere in Europe, of how we will cope with paying the retirement of people. This is clearly a problem of losing the temporal momentum when the state makes a decision. The energy problem is the same problem. We are using the energy that will no longer be available for the future generation. This was not a problem for the old state. There were a reservoir of energy, and the problem was that everybody should get the amount that it merits. And now the problem is that the reservoir is too short. And the good governance should be now the way to explain people or make people being aware and understand that their individual interest is completely different with the interest of the planet or the generations. I think this is quite new as an issue because for many of those problems we have no solutions and we don't see solutions. And even the way it is governed is not obvious. For instance, let's compare the solution we had for energy and agriculture in the past in France, because this is the example I know. Agriculture, we had a policy. The policy was to be self-sustaining as far as food is concerned. And the solution was to involve people working with the earth, the agriculture. And now we have an agriculture where the state pay for food for everybody. And we fund agriculture in all Europe, and especially in France. And France is sometimes blocking the evolution of Europe because of the past being too much in favor of the people that were concerned. Energy was a quite different thing. But the aim was also to get an energetic independence when we had this petroleum shock. And then the engineers took the power and said, nobody will ever understand because it's so complex. But we are able to build nuclear power plants that provides energy without any risk of a petroleum shock, and we will provide energy to all people. And there were a lot of complaints, but people were not really heard about their feeling about it. This was imposed. And in fact, we can see, and I am provocative because I am in favor of discussing with people about those issues which are very important. But I have to admit that this is a success, and it explains why a country like France is in a good situation as far as the Kyoto Convention is concerned, because we use a form of energy which is good for the environment. And we did not discuss that with people, which is a very bad governance of the system. And now we try to improve our governance of this, but it's a sort of taboo. And
isn't that the temporal problem?
This is a temporal problem because the temporal, because we have solutions for the next centuries. Whereas with petroleum, we have no solution, and with agriculture, we have no solutions for the next decades. Of course, we have no forever lasting solution, but we have solution for several centuries. So I think we have to think about this way. The governance is a scale problem, and we have no solutions for the moment.
Adrienne?
Yeah. 3 points which two questions actually, which is the point. I think in the discussion whether it is more appropriate to have universal solutions as opposed to decentralized, flexible solutions for particular problems which public policy, public administration, in cooperation with private actors or not, deal with, I think there is no general answer. It depends. I think it depends on the desirability of particular policies, and it depends on the problem at hand. I mean, I would immediately, acknowledge that it is not desirable to pay different levels of welfare payments in different regions of the country. That is a universal solution. That should not be that persons depend on the charity of their municipalities on whether they can survive or not. So that is a political decision as regarding what is desirable, and there are no general answers to this. By contrast, in this provision of particular services, social services which are very client-oriented, I think it doesn't make sense to have a general solution from the center, political center, or from central administration. So it depends on the problem at hand.
Do you already have a heuristic?
Sorry?
Do you already have a heuristic?
There is a lot of literature out there which is looking at different types of policies and
which context?
Policy analysis literature. And another point which I wanted to mention, which is actually referred, which it's a question to people who do public administration hearing. I think he mentioned a very important point which I found very interesting when he said we panic very often in public administration. We need solutions quick and they're not there. And this need, or what it means in terms of administrative action and preparing of policy solutions, I think is not being taken into account by science at all. This aspect of time, a lack of time shortage, and what it means in terms of action and actually good solutions. And then, of course, it's no wonder that very often what you mentioned, that how little is done actually. A lot is announced, but little is actually done, which of course was a big topic for implementation research in the 70s. And it continued to be so. It's a lot about announcing things, but not really doing things.
Perhaps I think that's a reasonable advice, and it's touched on in your paper, where it says are we too political as public administration, are we becoming too political? So we tend to respond to that quick fixes, and should there be a role in public administration to do exactly what Eric says and think long term, because politicians will always be short term. And how do you balance that? Because they're always linked to the next election, and how much do we get sucked into that? Who is doing that long term? Otherwise, you're not just going to go from one short term speaking answer to another.
I think the theory is way too much geared to the long-term perspective and not to the short-term time pressure and quick fixes.
So the theory of bringing that together, how do we bring that together?
Well, I had some comments about the issue discussed actually a few speakers ago about this old and new state. And to be honest, I'm one of the persons who is always confused about this old and new state concepts. As with many things we've been discussing here today, actually old and new mean quite different things for different people. For example, for Estonia, old state quite often means a state we had on the Soviet Union at the same time. For UK, old state may mean actually maybe a time before Thatcher, maybe a time during the Thatcher, but before John Major, and so on. So in this context, I recall one of the statements made by Kai Peters, and what he said was that before modernizing or bringing in new ideas, you actually have to have quite well-established old-style Bavarian bureaucracy. And that's maybe one thing we didn't have in Estonia before we started to take over new modern ideas. And there are few examples where you can see that it was a problem. For example, there was a problem with organizing parking in our capital, and the solution was actually contracting out this management. And it was thought that actually that's easiest and the most efficient solution. We have a small local government, it's cheaper, and so on, so on. At the same time, bureaucracy wasn't strong enough to be a good contracting party, which means that nowadays we have always problems that the company which is offering services is prevailing in negotiating some contract specifics. So what I'm saying is that old state is not always a bad state, and maybe psychologically it would be better if we use instead of old state the term traditional state. It sounds better, and we don't feel psychologically that old is bad and new is good, which is not always the case. So it's not clear answer with this, and I also wanted to comment another issue which we also discussed before. It was whether public administration has added value to other disciplines, and I think that it's also, we don't have clear square answers to this, because it depends again on this administrative culture and also on the level of public administration taught in universities. Dina mentioned before that we have 3 universities teaching public administration, but of course the level of teaching is very different, and the students' or outcome is also very different, and the value given to this teaching is different. And you can't really say that label public administration has added value, because it depends what is in substance. Because let's say if we say that say no to economics, and what we have to do is maybe to change curricula and add a few economics subjects into curricula. If they are not very good in law, maybe we should add a little bit more law. But in practical level, as I understand, I'm supposed to represent here practitioners. These kind of questions don't come out very often, because a few of my people who are very good lawyers, they say that after 5 years working in Ministry of Justice, they are not lawyers anymore, because they know very little about law. They know very good about sociological, how to read and understand sociological processes. They know very well budgeting processes, personnel management, and everything else, but they would not be able anymore to work as a lawyer. So, and also in the same department, I have a person who graduated public administration, and he has developed quite a good command in law at the same time. So we can't expect to say that no added value in public administration as such. It depends on the substance again. Probably substance is different in France, in Estonia, in the UK, and everything else. So if you're trying to find here some clear answers, we will not probably find them here today. So that's basically what I wanted to say. A few comments.
Yes, could I come back a little bit on the question of politics and administration, and particularly in post-communist states? And this is something which I, again, last 3 years I find myself working with all the time, on a daily basis, and having to think about, therefore, when there's time to think about it. But And I've begun to develop partly conversations with Guy Peters, really. I mean, and by the way, I think everything we say about that, I defer to the people from those countries. I mean, tell me if I'm getting this wrong. But it seems to me that there's a tendency for a lot of outsiders, particularly consultants, to not understand sufficiently the fusion of party and state that took place before, whether in the USSR or in the Central and East European countries that were part of the USSR. That's to say that it wasn't that the party apparatus ran everything, and it wasn't that the state was the state in the way we understand it. That's why I like your point about let's be too simple dichotomy between old and new state. It was rather that the party used the state apparatus. I mean, the state apparatus, which was inherited from the Reichstag largely in Central and Eastern Europe, even in the Soviet Union, I think, even in, maybe it was a Tsarist state, I don't know, in Russia, but it was pretty much intact. I mean, what I have found, not in all countries, but in the ones I worked in, is the extent to which the transition it really has not been that disruptive in terms of the administrative apparatus. I mean, civil servants and those who teach public administration in the old meaning, carry on in much the same way. And they still tend to see, I think it's less so in Estonia, but in other places, which would be less fast in so-called transition, that people still, and a lot of what they get from Western Europe in the way of advice reinforces that, because they hear a lot of traditional administrators from Germany, Austria, and so on, who are kind of giving them very much what they want to hear, which is there is a continuity. There's a sort of rediscovery, if you like, of the Reichstag, what I've seen, and this particularly, by the way, at the federal level in Yugoslavia, that it's one has to realise that there is an administrative mode being carried on, which is very much a legalistic one, and that was always the case. But of course, under the rule of the party, it was a facade, and this is what led to this disreputability. And the big problem is how to overcome that, how to restore law, really, and administration as things which are considered respectable by people. And indeed how to modernise it. But of course, I mean, I don't know about Estonia in this regard, but in the places I've seen, this has not happened. I mean, what has happened, there are different ways this is reflected, and it's there are different extremes, really. I mean, Central Asia is rather special, but it is sometimes extreme cases are good ones. I mean, really, literally, the party. I mean, you have elections which are more or less democratic, depending on the country, and depending on what you mean by democracy, but more or less free, let's say. I mean, Kyrgyzstan has quite reasonably free elections. I mean, you could say more than Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. But nevertheless, there has hardly been any change in terms of personnel from before 1990 or 1993, in case of Kyrgyzstan, or in the methods they use to govern. And I mean, what is most interesting about the trend, I'm taking an extreme case, but I think that by degrees, much the same could be said about the Baltic states and certainly Hungary. I mean, the West Balkans are a problem to themselves. But one way or another, if you take this extreme case, you can work to the less extreme ones around it. But what is very interesting is how little transition there's actually been in terms of public administration, and how it's been possible to preserve so much of the old system, even in terms of the political leadership. And even when there's been a new political leadership, it tends to have adopted the same things. Now this reinforces to some extent my sort of rather daring view that the difference between East and West in the past was one of degree rather than kind. Because the problems of politicization, a lot of people have mentioned public administration, is what you said that sparked all this off about the UK politicization, that really that's something which, again, we're not dealing with, we're not facing up to. It's an issue for the discipline of public administration to deal with, indeed. How one deals with the short-term, ephemeral political interest, and it's not only in terms of time, but also in terms of power and so on, and the way things are viewed in terms of efficiency and finance and issues like corruption and so on. But this is a problem, of course. It's a major problem in Western countries, particularly those that were quickest to adopt new public management and to adopt a more market-based approach to government. That issues of corruption and so on arise, as well as problems of decisions too much based on the short term. But I think it's very interesting to get that perspective from Central and Eastern Europe, where, despite the emergence of political parties, that really they have not reached the stage of having a stable system of public administration. The administration is still highly politicized. Sometimes it's still the same individuals, but even when it's not the same individuals, as in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, they're still thinking in terms of the minister decides, or the party decides, or the parties. It even applies where you have a coalition government, where the parties allocate ministries very strictly on a party basis, and the ministries operate quite separately from each other. And it's considered right to do that. And you completely bypass the established public administration, just as you did in the old days, or you keep them subordinate. Their job is simply to pass the minor subordinate regulations, whereas all the policy is made in the minister and his personal advisors. The personal advisors are invariably paid by UNDP. They are in Serbia, actually, nearly all paid by UNDP. This is an interesting phenomenon that one might look at in terms of the influence of international organisations. The EU also pays a lot of, basically political appointments in the ministries in the name of, it's called capacity building, actually. This is how this struck me so much, because I was responsible. I got out of it in horror, but I mean, I'm now